The story of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping is not just a tale of two men. It is the story of two nations, locked in a struggle for global dominance. When Trump, a brash outsider with a flair for disruption, took the US presidency in 2016, he brought an unpredictable, America-first approach that challenged decades of diplomatic norms. Across the Pacific, Xi Jinping, disciplined and strategic, was quietly steering China toward the China Dream, a vision of national resurgence and global influence. Their clash was inevitable. Trump thrived on spectacle, rapid action, and confrontation. Xi excelled in patience, calculation, and long-term strategy. Trade wars, tariffs, and technological rivalries tested the limits of both nations' resolve. Military maneuvers in the South China Sea, disputes over Hong Kong and Taiwan, and even the global pandemic became arenas of tension. This is a story of personalities, ideologies, and systems colliding, of brashness versus patience, disruption versus strategy, and short-term wins versus long-term vision. The Trump-Xi rivalry did not just shape US-China relations. It reshaped the world, leaving a legacy that will echo for decades. The story of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping is more than just the tale of two men. It is the collision of two worlds, two systems, and two visions of global power. For centuries, the relationship between the United States and China was marked by distance, misunderstanding, and uneven exchange. But in the 21st century, it became something much deeper, a struggle for supremacy that shaped economies, military strategies, and the very architecture of international order. When Donald J. Trump rose to power in 2016, as the 45th President of the United States, he brought with him a worldview unlike that of any of his predecessors. He was not a career politician, but a businessman, a real estate mogul, and a television personality who thrived on disruption and confrontation. Xi Jinping, on the other hand, had carefully maneuvered through the disciplined hierarchy of the Chinese Communist Party, consolidating authority in ways unseen since Mao Zedong. Their meeting on the global stage was less a diplomatic exchange than a collision course, the kind of clash that history often remembers as pivotal. Long before Trump even announced his candidacy, he had been a vocal critic of China. He accused Beijing of manipulating its currency, stealing American jobs, and taking advantage of trade agreements that weakened US industry. His rallies were filled with fiery rhetoric about bringing manufacturing back home and punishing China for what he called unfair practices. Xi Jinping, meanwhile, was charting his China Dream, a national rejuvenation project that aimed to restore China's place as a great power after what his government termed the century of humiliation. By the time Trump took office in January 2017, both men had already built the ideological foundations for confrontation. Trump, with his America First doctrine, and Xi with his vision of a confident, globally assertive China. Their first meeting came in April 2017 at Mar-a-Lago, Trump's private estate in Florida. On the surface, it was cordial. Trump showed Xi the luxurious Millennium. Trump entertained Peng Liyuan, Xi's wife, and the leaders spoke of cooperation. Yet behind the smiles, tension simmered. Only hours after sharing dessert, Trump ordered a missile strike on Syria and made sure she was informed during dinner. A deliberate show of strength, designed to remind the Chinese leader that he was dealing with an American president who believed in power. Projection. Xi, unflinching, observed and responded with calm, offering no outward sign of being rattled. It was an early moment that set the tone for their relationship. Trump preferred shock and dominance. Xi preferred patience and steadiness. Both were playing long games, but with very different strategies. The trade war became the defining feature of their clash. Trump, fulfilling his campaign promises, launched tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. accusing Beijing of intellectual property theft and unfair subsidies. She retaliated with his own tariffs, targeting American farmers, especially soybeans, a calculated move designed to pressure Trump's political base in the Midwest. For the first time in decades, the world witnessed the two largest economies weaponize trade against one another on a scale never seen before. Trump would often boast that trade wars are good and easy to win, but the reality proved far more complex. American consumers faced higher prices, supply chains grew strained, and U.S. businesses felt the pressure. Meanwhile, China endured pain but leveraged state control to cushion the blow. Neither side fully gave in, and the conflict dragged on, reshaping global trade. Beyond economics, Trump and Xi's relationship touched nearly every dimension of geopolitics. Trump questioned America's alliances in Asia, pressured South Korea and Japan to contribute more financially to their defense, and repeatedly pushed for a tougher stance against China in the South China Sea. Xi, in contrast, expanded China's military footprint, constructing artificial islands and deploying missiles in contested waters, asserting sovereignty in defiance of international law. The standoff created a new era of great power rivalry, one in which smaller nations were often forced to choose sides. Yet the clash was not without moments of strange camaraderie. Trump often praised Xi personally, calling him a strong leader, even a king for life. After Xi abolished presidential term limits, their personal relationship was a paradox, publicly combative, privately marked by a degree of respect. Trump admired strength and authority, and Xi embodied both. But admiration did not soften the hard edges of policy. The tariffs remained, the sanctions deepened, and the rhetoric escalated. Trump insisted America was reclaiming its greatness by standing up to China, while Xi portrayed Trump's actions as proof of American decline and desperation. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, a crisis that further sharpened the clash. Originating in Wuhan, China, the virus spread rapidly across the globe. Trump accused China of covering up the outbreak, calling it the China virus and demanding accountability. Xi defended his country's response, portraying China as a victim and later as a global benefactor by exporting vaccines and medical supplies. The pandemic turned what was already a tense rivalry into a war of narratives. Trump's handling of the crisis was heavily criticized at home, but he doubled down on blaming Beijing, further fueling hostility. For Xi, the crisis was an opportunity to highlight the weaknesses of Western democracies, contrasting them with the efficiency of China's authoritarian system. Throughout Trump's presidency, Xi remained patient, where Trump thrived on spectacle, tweets, and public confrontations. Xi worked quietly, strengthening China's Belt and Road Initiative, consolidating power within the Communist Party, and expanding China's technological influence through companies like Huawei, while Trump sought short-term wins that could play well with his base. Xi pursued decades-long strategies, designed to outlast any U.S. administration. This fundamental difference in time horizons meant that Trump and Xi were often playing two entirely different games, yet locked on the same board. Their clash was not just about trade, military might, or public health. It was about ideology. Trump represented a surge of populist nationalism in America, a rejection of globalism and international institutions. Xi embodied the rise of authoritarian capitalism, where state power and economic ambition merged into a singular vision of dominance. Together, they symbolized the defining tension of the 21st century: democracy versus authoritarianism, free markets versus state control, openness versus censorship. The world watched as these two figures clashed, not only with each other, but with the very systems they represented. Even after Trump left office in January 2021, the impact of his relationship with Xi lingered. the trade war he began did not fully end, and his confrontational stance toward China became bipartisan consensus in Washington. Xi, emboldened, continued to press forward with his vision of a China-led order. The clash of Trump and Xi was not a temporary episode, but a historical turning point that reshaped the global balance of power. Their story is a reminder that individuals at the top of nations can alter the trajectory of history, and when two such powerful, contrasting figures collide, the world trembles in the aftershocks. And so the history of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping is not merely a personal rivalry, it is the chronicle of a shifting world order, a confrontation between two visions, and a battle that will echo for generations. The contest between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping was also shaped by the weight of history. The United States had long viewed itself as the indispensable nation, a guarantor of global order, a champion of free markets, and the most powerful military on earth. China, for its part, had endured a long period of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, before rising from the wreckage of revolution under Mao Zedong, by the time Xi Jinping rose to the helm of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, he had set his sights on restoring China's centrality in the world order. For him, the 21st century was destined to be the Chinese century. For Trump, whose campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," resonated with millions of disaffected Americans, the United States was to remain the dominant power, no matter the cost. Their ambitions collided, like tectonic plates beneath the global stage, producing tremors felt in every capital from London to Tokyo, from Moscow to Brasilia. Trump's negotiating style was unlike any leader she had previously faced, where she thrived on careful preparation, long-term strategy, and rigid party discipline. Trump relied on unpredictability, instinct, and bravado. In the boardrooms of Manhattan, this style had served him well. But on the international stage, unpredictability became both a weapon and a liability. Trump saw diplomacy as an extension of deal-making. She saw diplomacy as the slow weaving of a global tapestry, where every thread was calculated. This fundamental difference meant that each encounter between them became not just a negotiation, but a cultural clash. One of the most dramatic phases of their rivalry unfolded in 2018, when Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports worth hundreds of billions of dollars. His administration accused China of engaging in intellectual property theft on a massive scale, with American companies losing trillions of dollars to what officials described as forced technology transfers. Trump's trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, spearheaded a hardline approach, framing China as a systemic threat to U.S. economic security. Xi, in response, framed Trump's moves as bullying and rallied nationalist sentiment at home. State media portrayed China as a victim of unjust American aggression, while also emphasizing the resilience of the Chinese people. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to show that Trump's pressure would only make China stronger. The trade war rippled across the globe. American farmers faced devastating losses when China slashed purchases of soybeans and pork, leading the Trump administration to issue billions in subsidies. Meanwhile, Chinese factories suffered from declining exports, but Beijing's centralized control allowed the government to direct financial support where needed, keeping unemployment low. Trump believed he could force Xi to capitulate through economic pain, but she calculated that endurance was China's greatest weapon. He reminded his people of the Long March, invoking historical memories of sacrifice and perseverance. In this way, the trade war became more than just about tariffs. It became a test of political willpower. Technology became another flashpoint. Trump's administration took aim at Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, banning its equipment from US networks and pressuring allies to do the same. The move was framed as a matter of national security, with concerns that Huawei's technology could be used for espionage by the Chinese government. Xi viewed the attack on Huawei as an attempt to stifle China's technological rise. He accelerated investment in domestic tech industries, pushing forward with plans for artificial intelligence, 5G, and semiconductors. The clash in technology symbolized the larger rivalry, the United States fighting to preserve its lead, China determined to leapfrog into the future. Amidst these tensions, Trump often oscillated between fiery attacks and unexpected praise. In one moment, he would accuse China of raping the American economy. In another, he would describe Xi as a brilliant leader and personal friend. This duality puzzled many observers but reflected Trump's transactional mindset. For him, even rivals could be admired if they demonstrated strength. Xi, however, never wavered in his approach. He maintained an outward calm, never allowing personal insults to derail his long-term strategy. He understood that Trump's volatility was part theater, part negotiation tactic. In Beijing's calculations, America's democratic system meant Trump was temporary, but China's Communist Party was permanent. Time, Xi believed, was on his side. The South China Sea remained another arena of contention. Trump authorized freedom of navigation operations, sending U.S. warships through contested waters to challenge China's territorial claims. She responded by fortifying artificial islands with runways and missile systems, effectively militarizing the waters despite earlier promises not to do so. Each side accused the other of aggression, and while open conflict was avoided, the region simmered with tension. Smaller Southeast Asian nations, caught between the two powers, hedged their bets trading with China, while seeking security assurances from the United States. The shadow of Trump and Xi's rivalry stretched far beyond Washington and Beijing. It redefined the choices of nations worldwide. Then came Hong Kong in 2019. Massive protests erupted against Beijing's encroachment on the city's autonomy. Millions marched in the streets, demanding democratic freedoms. Trump, while initially hesitant to intervene, eventually signed legislation supporting the protesters, a move that infuriated Xi. For the Chinese leader, Hong Kong was a red line, a core part of national sovereignty. The crackdown that followed showcased Xi's determination to silence dissent and tighten control. Trump used the moment to portray China as oppressive, while Xi used it to rally Chinese nationalism, claiming that foreign powers were instigating chaos. The episode deepened the perception of an unbridgeable divide between the two leaders. When the COVID-19 pandemic erupted in late 2019 and early 2020, the rivalry reached its most explosive stage. Trump accused China of covering up the outbreak, spreading misinformation, and unleashing devastation upon the world. He labeled it the China virus and demanded investigations into the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Xi, facing international scrutiny, pushed back hard, presenting China as both victim and savior, providing aid to nations struggling with the outbreak. The pandemic became a propaganda war, with Trump insisting on Chinese culpability and Xi portraying China as a responsible great power. The trust between the two nations, already fragile, shattered completely. Domestically, Trump's handling of the pandemic drew intense criticism, and his repeated attacks on China were seen as attempts to shift blame. Xi, meanwhile, leveraged China's swift lockdowns and strict controls to argue that authoritarian governance was superior to chaotic democracy. The rivalry thus transcended economics and geopolitics, becoming a battle over systems of governance themselves. Trump and Xi no longer just clashed as leaders. They symbolized two competing models of the future. By the time the 2020 US election arrived, relations between the two powers were at their lowest point in decades. She watched as Trump battled for re-election amidst a pandemic, economic turmoil, and widespread protests at home. For Xi, the turbulence in America reinforced his belief that China's rise was unstoppable. Trump, even as he praised Xi's leadership at times, ultimately cast China as the great rival against which America must rally. The stage was set not for reconciliation, but for a rivalry that would endure far beyond either man's tenure. After the 2020 election, the world entered a new phase of uncertainty. Trump's loss to Joe Biden did not immediately change the underlying dynamics of US-China relations. Xi Jinping, having watched the turmoil of the American democratic process unfold with a mixture of amusement and strategic calculation, understood that the American system, while powerful, was inherently vulnerable to internal discord. China's centralized authority, by contrast, appeared stable and unshakable. The transition in Washington did little to alter Beijing's strategic calculations. Xi continued his programs of military modernization, technological innovation, and global influence expansion, while the United States grappled with domestic divisions and questions about its own global role. Trump himself remained a force in American politics, a constant reminder to Beijing that the unpredictability he embodied could return at any time. His critiques of Xi and China, delivered via social media, speeches, and rallies, kept the narrative of confrontation alive. Xi, careful to maintain dignity and control, often ignored these provocations publicly. Though Chinese analysts and advisors surely considered the implications of a possible Trump return to power, the Chinese leader was patient. He knew that history favored the enduring, not the transient. In private meetings with top officials, she reportedly emphasized that America's short-term turbulence could be leveraged to China's long-term advantage. Meanwhile, the technological rivalry intensified. The United States continued to restrict Chinese companies like Huawei, Tencent, and ByteDance, while China accelerated its push for independence in semiconductor production, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. The global supply chain became a battlefield in itself, with both powers seeking dominance over critical industries. Trump's earlier tariffs had set the precedent for using economic leverage as a weapon, and Xi's response demonstrated China's ability to endure pressure while simultaneously investing in future strength. Each action, reaction, and countermeasure deepened the sense of a permanent structural clash between the two nations. In the military sphere, tensions did not abate. The South China Sea remained heavily militarized, and Chinese incursions into Taiwan's airspace and waters increased steadily. Trump's tenure had set the tone for American pushback, and even under Biden, the U.S. maintained strong military and diplomatic support for Taiwan. Xi, determined to assert sovereignty, pursued both subtle coercion and overt demonstrations of force. Each naval exercise, each missile deployment, and each diplomatic statement was calculated to test American resolve. For Xi, projecting strength at home and abroad reinforced his legitimacy and authority, while simultaneously signaling that China would not be intimidated by Trump-era threats or any future American administration. The clash between Trump and Xi also played out in international institutions. The World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and global health organizations became arenas where the two powers sought to project influence. Trump had famously criticized multilateral organizations as ineffective and biased against the United States, withdrawing from some and threatening others. Xi, in contrast, used these institutions to advance China's interests, promoting initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and contributing to global development projects. The differing approaches reflected a larger ideological battle. Trump's America First isolationism versus Xi's vision of China as a responsible global leader responsible on his terms. Even culture and information became points of conflict. Trump often accused China of censorship, propaganda, and shaping narratives to weaken the United States. Xi, meanwhile, emphasized the importance of ideological control, both domestically and abroad, promoting narratives of Chinese success while countering criticism. Social media platforms, news networks, and think tanks became extensions of this contest, with each side seeking to influence perception and policy worldwide. The clash between Trump and Xi was no longer confined to trade, military, or diplomacy. It had entered the realm of global consciousness, shaping how nations and citizens understood power itself. Despite the intensity of their rivalry, moments of indirect dialogue persisted. When the pandemic worsened or trade negotiations showed signs of progress, Trump occasionally praised Xi personally, noting his intelligence or negotiating skill. Xi, ever disciplined, responded in ways that preserved dignity while never compromising his objectives. The personal dynamic between them was complex. Trump's brash, spontaneous nature often collided with Xi's calculated, measured approach. Yet beneath the surface, both leaders understood the stakes. Each recognized the other as a formidable opponent, capable of influencing not only bilateral relations, but the trajectory of global history. By mid-2021 and into 2022, the geopolitical landscape continued to reflect the echoes of the Trump-Xi era. Supply chains remained strained. Military posturing in the Indo-Pacific remained high, and ideological narratives continued to diverge sharply. Xi's China projected an image of resilience and growth, while America wrestled with the consequences of internal division and the challenges of maintaining global leadership. Analysts around the world debated the lasting impacts of the Trump-Xi confrontation. Some argued that it marked the start of a new Cold War, others that it accelerated China's rise, while still others warned of the dangers inherent in an unpredictable, high-stakes rivalry. The confrontation was also generational. While Trump's approach relied on immediate, visible victories that could resonate with domestic audiences, Xi's strategy was long-term, designed to endure decades in shape the global order well into the middle of the century. Each decision, whether in trade, technology, or military affairs, was part of a grander chessboard in which the pieces represented not just national interests, but the future trajectory of civilization itself. Trump's era had forced Xi to respond with agility and determination, and Xi's patience and persistence had, in turn, tested the limits of American resolve. Even as history moved forward, the legacy of their clash remained. Diplomatic negotiations were never simple. Military posturing remained constant, and the world continued to watch as the balance of power shifted. Trump's influence, though no longer in the Oval Office, persisted in shaping policy debates, congressional decisions, and public opinion. Xi, meanwhile, consolidated authority within China, ensuring that the nation could withstand pressure while advancing its strategic vision. The interplay between their leadership styles, personalities, and objectives had created a paradigm in which both immediate actions and long-term calculations mattered, a paradigm that would influence the global order for decades to come. As the 2020s progressed, the legacies of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping became inseparable from the global shifts they had set in motion. The rivalry they embodied was no longer simply about personalities. It had become a symbol of the competing visions for the 21st century. Trump's tenure had shattered the complacency of decades, challenging the assumption that U.S. power could be taken for granted. Xi, in turn, had proven that China could endure disruption, absorb shocks, and continue its steady ascent toward global influence. The interaction between the two leaders had created a new paradigm in international relations, one where unpredictability and discipline, brashness and calculation could collide with lasting consequences. Even after Trump left the White House, the political and economic frameworks he established continued to influence U.S.-China relations. Tariffs, sanctions, and technology restrictions remained partially in place, serving as enduring reminders of the conflict. For Xi, this was confirmation of the accuracy of his long-term strategy to prepare China for a world in which American policy might swing unpredictably. But Chinese objectives would remain consistent. China's Belt and Road Initiative continued to expand. Its domestic economy adapted to new pressures, and its military modernization accelerated. The clash with Trump had underscored the necessity of resilience, and Xi ensured that the lesson would endure within the party and across the nation. The personal dynamic between Trump and Xi, while less visible after 2021, continued to resonate. Trump's brash approach, his emphasis on spectacle, and his willingness to challenge norms had forced Xi to adapt, testing the limits of patience and strategic flexibility. Xi's measured, patient, and long-term approach had in turn forced Washington and the world to recognize the depth of China's ambitions and capabilities. In a sense, each had sharpened the other, each defining the parameters of what the other must confront. The world had witnessed not just a clash of two leaders, but a confrontation of systems, ideologies, and visions of power. The consequences of their rivalry would ripple for decades. Economically, nations reconsidered their supply chains, trade dependencies, and technological partnerships. Militarily, alliances in the Indo-Pacific solidified as countries sought protection against uncertainty, while new power structures emerged to accommodate the growing strength of China. Politically, both democracy and authoritarianism were tested, with the global community observing how leadership styles and governance models influenced outcomes in times of crisis. Socially and culturally, narratives shaped by their confrontation influenced perceptions of national identity, global responsibility, and the balance between freedom and security. In historical retrospect, the era of Trump and Xi was a turning point. It marked a period when two dominant powers, led by two distinctive leaders, engaged not just in competition, but in a fundamental redefinition of global order. Trump's presidency had demonstrated the disruptive potential of unconventional leadership, while Xi's tenure illustrated the power of strategic patience and centralized authority. Their interactions became case studies in leadership, negotiation, and geopolitical strategy, analyzed by scholars, policymakers, and historians for generations to come. Ultimately, the story of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping is not merely a chronicle of conflict. It is a reflection of the modern world, with all its complexities, uncertainties, and opportunities. It is a reminder that history is often shaped by the collision of personalities as much as by ideologies, and that the actions of a few can reverberate across continents and through time. While Trump and Xi may occupy different spaces in memory, one celebrated, one vilified, one unpredictable, one controlled, they're intertwined. Legacies define a new chapter in international relations. As the world moves forward, scholars will debate who won or lost in their confrontation. But the more enduring truth is that their clash irrevocably altered the trajectory of global power. The story of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping is, in essence, the story of the 21st century itself, a century defined by rivalry, ambition, and the struggle for supremacy between two nations and two visions of the future. And in that struggle, both men left marks that will endure far beyond their lifetimes, shaping the choices, strategies, and destinies of nations for generations to come. The chapter of Trump and Xi is closed, but the echoes of their confrontation remain, resonating through economies, militaries, ideologies, and the minds of leaders yet to come. In history's vast continuum, few rivalries have so clearly illustrated the power of leadership, the stakes of global competition, and the indelible impact of two men whose visions collided on the world stage.